Well, I'll tell you guys one thing. I definitely wasn't expecting that.
Who are you, Gabriel?
Hey guys, welcome back to Pop Culture at Pat. Today we are talking about James Wan's new horror film, Malignant, which is in theaters right now. So in Malignant, Annabelle Wallis plays a woman named Madison who begins to have these visions of people getting murdered, but soon realizes these aren't just visions, but actual events happening in real life. And that's all I'm going to say about this, because my biggest advice is definitely going into this film, go in as blind as possible, and also just with an open mind, because this is definitely different than any other horror film that James Wan has done in his past up to this point. And I would say just also in general, this is going to be different than a lot of horror films, especially for like mainstream audiences that you guys have probably seen. If you've seen like a lot of like horror, you probably will see like elements from other films like in this movie. But for the general audience who's going to see this film, definitely going to be a lot different than what you guys are expecting, from the trailers like overall. So just go into it with an open mind. I think you'll get the most enjoyment out of it, going in that way. One of the biggest things for me, why I really appreciate this film is because it's just so different from, especially in, the mainstream side of things, just so different from a lot of the horror films that we've gotten in recent memory. The movie takes a lot of risk, and it gets pretty wild at one point, especially when you get to like the third act. And in doing so, I feel like a lot, and you can already kind of see it with some of like the reviews and scores by people, that you're either going to love this movie because of some of the risk and different things that it does in this film, or you're not going to really care for it at all. You're probably going to hate it. And I know it's funny enough, because I did a video not too long ago with my boy Jack from Let's Crash This Parade, and we were talking about how nowadays it seems like you either love a movie or you hate it. And usually for the most part, you can kind of a lot of times it's like, oh, there's a gray area. But I feel with this movie, it's definitely going to be one of those where it's like you either do love it or you hate it. I feel like there's not going to be a lot of those that are kind of like in between. So that's why I'm saying just go into this thing with a fresh, open mind as possible. There's also a twist in this film that, I kind of thought I knew where they were going, with the movie, like fairly early on. I thought I did. And I was like, okay, it'll be interesting to see how this kind of plays out. And we got to the twist, because I heard there was a big twist, going into the film. So I kind of had that spoiled for me a little bit. Not the actual what happened, but just that there was a twist. So I was like, yep, I think this is kind of what they're going for. And they actually went a different route. So that kind of took me off guard and really, impressed me. And I would say if you guys, for those of you who don't, can't pick up on the twist, some of you guys, it'll definitely shock you, especially I feel like if you haven't seen a lot of horror films and you haven't experienced some of the crazier movies that are out there, and you're just a kind of a casual moviegoer seeing this thing, you're probably going to be like, holy fucking shit, what did I just see? What just happened? I also thought the cinematography for this film was beautiful. There was a lot of uses of reds and blues, and I believe that was, intentional, because James Wan was paying tribute to, some older horror films, specifically 70s and 80s horror. So there was a lot of reds and blues, and even Madison's house, our main character, when you see the outside of her house, it looks, even during the day, it looks like something straight, you're yep, this is definitely a creepy ass haunted house. If you're walking down the street, you're like, yep, that's the one that's haunted. So, they did a really good job with that. And it kind of plays into the campiness that this movie has. There's another part where they see another building that's kind of you see the moon in the background. And I don't want to go into too many details because I want to have you guys going as fresh as possible. But just they did a really good job, creating this really spooky, creepy atmosphere that I really appreciated. And there's also a lot of really cool shots. I'll tell you guys one, specifically that it has to do, being inside this house. And we have this one character that's going from running across the house from room to room. And we get this really cool aerial shot. So you see the person going in the one room, cutting through the door, going to these other rooms. That was really cool, and there's a lot of really, neat shots like that set up throughout the film. So just overall, I thought the film was, directed, fantastically. It's James Wan. He he's been in the genre, for a while now. He's done other movies as well, and you can just see he was kind of putting on like a tour de force as far as like directing goes, in my opinion. I also really dug the score too. It's, again, you can kind of tell that this movie, going into it, one of the things I will tell you guys is that it's definitely going for that, kind of cheesy campiness that some of the like 70s and 80s horror films like had. And, even though some of the acting and some of the dialogue can be a little questionable at times, it's a difference rather than where that's what they're going for with this movie compared to like a film where that kind of happens by accident and you're like, oh no, like I can tell you guys are actually trying and it's just not working. This, you can tell that they're going for that campiness factor. And so, for me being a big, fan of like the horror genre, I really appreciated that, that nice little tribute to some of those like older films. I feel like though, if you don't, again, if you haven't seen a lot of like, like horror movies, you might go into this like, not seeing a lot of like 70s, 80s, horror films and being like, oh my God, like the dialogue and the acting is terrible. So just a heads up, kind of so you know what to expect going into this film. But it's totally done on purpose. Now, I would say as far as like negatives go, I really only had like, two things. So for me, and I guess like going into this film, I said don't expect like a traditional horror movie because even for like, so for James Wan standards and even just like horror in general, don't go into this expecting like just like your typical kind of horror movie, especially with like a lot of the stuff that's come out recently, because it has a lot of like horror elements into it, but there's also like, some like sci-fi, there's definitely some like, that campiness, that like comedy like aspect to it too. So the one thing that I wish that maybe it would have done a little bit better, or I was hoping for, I guess, was for it to be, because it's really, to me, it's never really scary at all throughout the film. And even if it wasn't scary, I wish there was a little bit more of like a creepiness factor to it. And it didn't really have that in this movie, unfortunately. And then just as far as like the CGI goes, there's some times where I was like, oh, like this is actually pretty cool. It's well done. But there's other moments in the film where they use the CGI. And like there's one specific sequence that I can think of where I was telling my friend, like afterwards, I was like, it looks like something straight up out of like a video game. And I'm just like kind of surprised because it's made by like a major studio. So the CGI was definitely a little questionable at times, but overall, I mean, those are really only my like, two problems that I had with like the film, like maybe a little bit of like pacing issues, but definitely not something that like took me out of the film. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. I went into it kind of like expecting like one thing, and man, what a wild ride that was. So I'm really happy with, with how like the film like turned out. But I can completely understand there's going to be a lot of people too that I think don't like this movie. And I think that's because, like just not going into it with like an open mind and expecting kind of like one kind of horror film, because that's what you've kind of like gotten with James Wan, what he's kind of built his career off of. I mean, he had like Saw, The Conjuring, but like mostly like The Conjuring and like Insidious and stuff like that. So I think a lot of people are probably expecting those type of movies. And I'm going to tell you that's not what you're getting with Malignant at all. So overall, James Wan pays tribute to 70s and 80s horror while giving a fresh take on the genre and taking audiences on a wild ride. Like I said, this was something that I really, really had a lot of fun with. Being like a big horror fan myself, I just like appreciated, like the campiness, because there's nothing better than some of those, those older like horror films where they just have that cheese factor to it, especially when it's like the good cheese. You know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so, the thing was really well directed, just like the way the film looked like overall. And I love the fact that this was made by, like a big studio, and it was made by, a director like James Wan. I feel like that's the only reason that it probably did get made, because I feel like if this was an unknown director and was like, hey, this is my idea, it might not have, gotten made. But it's pretty cool that James Wan decided, he's like, hey, you know what? My next film, I'm going to go back to the horror genre, but I'm going to do something completely different, some completely like wild and out there. And, he gave this to us. So, and just within a day, and don't get me wrong, I like, a lot of like the superhero movies. I'm a sucker, I watch a ton of sequels and stuff like that. So don't get me wrong. I like all those movies, but it's just so refreshing to see something that's a little bit different rather than just all those type of movies. Sometimes, it's nice to see that every now and then, I should say. But yeah, so I'm really curious to see or to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this movie. Like I said, it's going to be one of those movies that kind of divides audiences, so I definitely want to hear your thoughts. Make sure, though, if you do leave your thoughts down below, definitely try and be spoiler free, because where this movie just came out this weekend, I want people to enjoy it and kind of go in not knowing what the twist is and stuff like that. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comments. Overall, as far as the score goes, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it, and I'll definitely be picking up when it comes out. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are down below in the comments. If you are new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button as well as the bell button next to it. That way you get notifications for all my new videos. Please give this video a thumbs up, and as always guys, please make sure to check back for more Pop Culture with Pat.